Jeremy, can you record? Excellent. Got it. Okay. All right then. A sort of apology, because this is an abbreviation of a full conclusion. So it may not flow. I've only read through it a couple of times since I sent it off to Jeremy. So it may not flow as exactly as I planned it to, because again, it's an abbreviation, if that makes sense. But my conclusion, chapter 7 in the dissertation, is entitled Constructing a Contingentist View of Macroevolution in Dialogue with Amorepotent Uncontrolling Love. You should have this document before you, I do believe. In my summary of the argument heretofore, I note that we are children of Darwin and an English school of adaptation and functionalism far older than evolutionary theory itself. However, Darwin remains our context. Now, we may revere Isaac Newton as a man of equal impact, but late modern physicists do not actively engage the ideas of its founder, that is, Newton, as they pursue their daily work. Darwin, on the other hand, my friends, continues to bestride our world like a colossus. Darwin's key claim for the creativity of natural selection and the resulting pathways of gradualism, adaptationism, and isotropy, I should say, of variation, builds the main line of defense for this powerful and venerable attitude toward nature and the changes in nature. For many biologists, including myself at times, these claims lie too close to the core of our deeply assimilated and now largely unconscious beliefs about the nature of gradualism, about the nature of adaptationism, and about the nature of isotropy in evolution, that is natural selection in its entirety. For these beliefs to be challenged or even overtly recognized as something potentially disputable. Yet a coherent alternative has been proposed and now provides one of the most trenchant contemporary critiques of strict Darwinism. Indeed, I believe that these critiques taken together will, or should, perhaps, reorient evolutionary theory into a far richer structure with a distinctively Darwinian core, at least at some point in the future anyway. That is akin to the Dumo of Milan, which, although the superstructure has been changed innumerable amounts of times over the centuries, has the same underlying structure. So too with this revised Darwinism that I am proposing in conjunction with Stephen Jay Gould. So too will it have the same underlying structure, but a different superstructure, so to speak. Now, I'll note that the important critiques can only operate against great orthodoxies. I earlier referenced the idea that Darwin continues to bestride our world like a colossus. However, that is not to say that Darwinian theory need not be reformed, reformulated, and refined. In fact, as aforementioned, I advocate with Gould some major restructuring of the basic Darwinian core of thought. This restructuring is an extension, not a replacement, of Darwin's overall vision. While the century before Darwin was in no wise ready to formulate such a concept due to a multitude of cultural factors, perhaps it is now time in the roughly century after Darwin to in fact do so. With the knowledge gained by various battles won and lost, by the way, over the previous roughly century. I'll remind you that Darwin wrote his treatise, if you will, in 1859, right, which we'll come back to later. But nevertheless, so it's been a rough, a century and a half there about, what have you. But in order to stay consistent, I wanted a century before and a century after, if that makes sense. Right. May this century finally be permitted to reform Darwin's evolutionary theories beyond the unidirectional, single level, and deterministic view of natural causality. That, my dear reader, or my dear friends, is my hope. Now, moving into some tentative conclusions reached after this pursuit. As to a few conclusions that I infer after going through all this material, allow me to stipulate that I assume that God is sentient, perhaps infinitely so, given the import and placement of sentience in the course of evolution on Earth. Additionally, I assume that God is complex, again, perhaps infinitely so, given the import and placement of complexity in the course of evolution on Earth. Thirdly, I assume that God is relational, perhaps infinitely so, given the import and placement of a relationality in the universe, or in the course of evolution on Earth, I should say. Fourthly, I assume that God is beautiful, perhaps infinitely so, given the import and placement of beauty in the course of evolution on Earth. Although many authors have sought to proverbially rescue traditional natural theology in the contemporary context, cross-reference Alistair McGrath's extensive oeuvre, or whatever, writings, I guess you could say, to put it bluntly. I think that it may be more kosher, rather, to speak of the concept as a natural theology from below. While I admit that I am favorable unto and gain quite a lot from McGrath et al., I would rather herein to consistently employ the terminology of natural theology from below instead. In so much as this book, or that dissertation, that is, but I'm sort of forward-looking and saying calling it a book because it is already under contract, of course. But nevertheless, in so much as this book is an exercise in an exploration of natural theology from below, or even one might could say bottom-up natural theology, we have learned from the processes of evolution at least what are the attributes of God, if not also how to understand the attributes of God from below. Transitioning to part 3, a new natural theology, towards a natural theology from below. So what does my theology from below that learns from evolutionary biology help us to understand about the nature of divine involvement? That is, using or employing evolutionary biology as my guide, what does it implicate for divine involvement in the natural world? I stipulate, in summary of my trip through the dissertation, that the processes of biological evolution give us metaphors with which to picture or frame God's involvement within the world. Overwhelmingly, I also conclude that God and the world cannot be totally separate from each other. There must needs be a confluence between the two, that is, panentheism. In my opinion, panentheism appropriately models the relationship between God and the world because it pictures the two as ultimately and completely and totally dependent upon one another, much like concentric circles depend upon one another. In this panentheistic analogy, God entirely and exhaustively interpenetrates the world, but is at the same time more than the world. In fact, I am bound from the preceding, which y'all are not privy to assert that God could not be God without a world to be in relationship with. Correlatively, the world would be mere chaos without a God with which to be in relationship. Further, I conclude that the notion of divine action, quote unquote, must be remodeled and reformulated for it to be kosher in today's late modern, scientifically cognizant world. Pointedly, old, that is traditional, ways of looking at divine action are no longer tenable. So then there must needs be a reformulation of divine action for it to remain palatable in today's contemporary world. I do this in a couple of manners within this dissertation. Because God totally and entirely interpenetrates the world, God beckons, God behooves, and God the eschaton. God then lures the world ultimately to himself. God's greatest goal, or telos, for the natural world is simply the generation of complexity, relationality, and beauty in varied and multifarious forms, along with the extension of diversity and multiplicities. God lavishes in the generation of diversity and complexity in and of themselves. This diversity and complexity please God, for God desires the multiplicity of forms as is modeled in the multiplicity of human beings in all their diversity. Moreover, a real capacity to experience the lure of the ultimate source of order and novelty allows, or better, enables the natural world to evolve over the course of time toward more intense forms of beauty. Further, my God of evolution does not coordinate things in advance, nor does he harbor exclusively the joy of creating. Instead, the God of evolution shares with every entity in the natural world, both biotic and non-biotic, their own openness to an indeterminate future. This perspective of my own brings special significance to every stage, so to speak, of nature's unfolding, that is evolutio, that being the basis of evolution itself, the basis of the term evolution itself, evolutio, including Homo species, that being us. After all, as John F. Holt is fond of saying, this is an unfinished universe. The preceding all leads to the questions that follow. Does biology and my theology from below give rise to any potential suggestions as to what it means for God to pull evolution teleologically, or that is toward a telos? While I take issue with the notion of God guiding something, as it means that God's self is behind it, pushing it forward, I do contend that in contrast, God is ever before entities, luring, wooing, and drawing them closer to God's self, the eschaton, wherein God will be all in all, and whereupon entities will be maximized in their complexity, their relationality, their beauty, and perhaps their diversity. At least that is according to the manner appropriate for that individual entity. For example, what I mean by that is, for example, a disabled person will not suddenly become non-disabled. And also, for example, the ramifications of my own brain injury or traumatic brain injury will not suddenly disappear. As an aside, I'm often queried about this contention of my own. Why, people ask me, do I think that God will not heal me of the fullness of my TBI at the eschaton? I respond to them the following. If God were to heal me of my TBI, the resulting entity, that being me, I guess, would no longer be me. Rather, summarily so, I contend that I am my damage. I am my TBI. To take that damage from me would result in an entity that is not me. But in so much as the individual entity is able, it will be protected in beauty, complexity, and relationality. And the Godhead will delight deliciously in the diversity of it all. So then, in my case, indeed, if God is truly marked by canonically donated, Amorepotent, and uncontrolling love, what would be the purpose of loving me out of who I am? That makes no sense. I stipulate that Gould's biology gives ample demonstration of this. Indeed, from Gould, I contend we can discern the natural world telling us that it's being lured toward God. When circumspectly analyzing Gould's contentions, they give an evidentiary pattern to the cone of increasing diversity, even though he would utterly deny such an assertion. However, in the 10 plus years, in the nearly 10 years post Gould's composition of Wonderful Life in 1999 CE, several of the oddballs, so to speak, in the Burgess shell fauna, those that so influenced Gould in his opinion, were accommodated within known phyla, as attested to by Conway Morris's The Crucible of Creation that was published in 1998 CE. And even more so in the 20 some odd years since the turn of the millennium, still yet further of these Gouldian oddballs, so to speak, have found their homes in contemporary phyla. So then, to me, it seems as though Gould's distinction between great disparity, that is, the difference between types of different things, and being present in the Cambrian era, but not great diversity, that is, the actual number of different things, has not withstood the test of time. Indeed, an evidentiary pattern to the cone of increasing diversity is ever apparent in the fossil record, as innumerable fossil shells demonstrate throughout the world. This increasing cone of diversity could be viewed as a sort of progress as well. Even though Gould himself vehemently denied such an appellation, he viewed it as problematic, even noxious. But we scientists can nevertheless discern a progression to the study of fossil records of previous life on the whole, although there are outliers. Furthermore, I contend that my phenomena of punctuated equilibrium is exactly what one would let me restate that. Furthermore, I contend the phenomenon of punctuated equilibrium is exactly what one would and should expect to find when a canonically donated, Amorepotent and uncontrollingly loving God is the supervenient influencer of influencers in the macroevolutionary process. That is, if God were to lure the universe toward God's self. Indeed, for punctuated equilibrium indicates that macroevolution proceeds by a series of jerks and fits, which aligns well with the notion of a patient God that I alluded to formerly, that allows stuff ultimately to work themselves out. It also bespeaks genuine relationality, for in the process of macroevolution by punctuated equilibrium, the entities within nature have genuine causal capacity, as does God. And these two warring sides, so to speak, do not always cooperate with each other. What does my theology from below, one that works through panentheistic emergentism, as well as punctuated equilibrium, and thus proceeds through long periods of stasis with relatively quick bursts of arising complexity, tell us about the nature of the divine, particularly with respect to what the divine entity values. Well, I have not developed the idea of pantheistic emergentism in this dissertation. Cross-reference Clayton's extensive voir for a similar notion, not exact notion, but similar notion. I stipulate that the divine nature values complexity, diversity, relationality, beauty, patience, and long-sufferingness. What theological conclusions are undercut by myself and the authors discussed in this dissertation? First and foremost, the entire concept of special creation is undercut and falsified. Further, the notion that there's a definite time period regarding creation is falsified. Thus, the assertion and idea that all of creation proceeded from a single divine act, especially in 6 calendar days, is falsified and undercut by the evolutionary biological data. And instead, the somewhat neglected traditional doctrine of creatio continua, that is continuous creation, is supported both by the biological data and myself. In a related sense, special divine action is also undercut by the central tenets of this book or dissertation. Hence, I am sad to say there are no miracles. More on this in another book forthcoming. What theological conclusions are supported or suggested by my interaction with the authors, mainly Gould, Roos, Conway Morris, Peirce, and Ord in this book? Pointedly, I assert that God must be found everywhere or nowhere. That is, God is necessarily immanent within the world. If God is anywhere, he must needs be here in the process, intimately and immanently interacting with entities. Further, God exalts in diversity and lavishes in beauty. God is patient with us humans as well as the other entities that fill nature, and all entities are better for it. Now, aside from the zoological interpretation of the animals, what finally is the difference between Gould and Conway Morris on the nature of history? Gould says that if history were to be rerun from the Cambrian, the outcome would be drastically different. The culling of extinction of one burgess animal rather than another might have been a matter of chance, but chance has a ramifying cascade of consequences. That is, subsequent history would have taken another course. This is what is meant by contingency, at least with reference to Gould. Conway Morris says, contrariwise, that history would have been broadly similar, whatever had been culled from the Cambrian, not identical, as if history were simply a deduction from the genome, but following a similar trajectory nonetheless. Conway Morris bases his argument on the observation, well known from paleontology, that similar biological morphologies arise repeatedly in history in response to the demands of life habit and habitat. The most familiar case that Conway Morris proffers is that of the tiger morphology, whereby saber-toothed cats in evolutionary history from unrelated ancestors. So then, if one animal ancestor had not yielded the cat morphology, then another one would have. This is not pure determinism by Conway Morris, but nonetheless, the idea retains a whiff of the great chain of being. This is because, for Conway Morris, only Homo sapiens, that is our particular subspecies, have access to transcendence, while Conway Morris does not say so explicitly. One nevertheless senses the pull of the divine in his writings. For example, in The Crucible of Creation and in Life Solution, that is from 1998, earlier mentioned in 2003, respectively, Conway Morris understands the significance of the Burgess shell in a completely different manner than Gould does. Moreover, the subtitle of Gould's Wonderful Life in 1989 is The Nature of History, which makes it clear that in the eyes of Gould, and I include Conway Morris in this camp as well, they are working toward an interpretation of the entire history of life. On the one side is representative of the liberal Jewish intellectual tradition from Cambridge, Massachusetts. On the other side is a conservative churchman from the Cambridge, UK establishment. Be that as it may, these two gentlemen could hardly come to more different conclusions based upon the same data sets than what has actually transpired. So then, what does the preceding analysis of Conway Morris's postulates mean biologically? Well, I suggest two things. First, there is ontological randomness in nature. God uses or employs this randomness in order to maximize the population of the natural world, that is the population by filling out, that is, if that makes sense to you, population of the natural world by maintaining dynamic equilibria in complex systems. But second, this ontological randomness does not preclude the derivation of propensities toward the expression of similar form, even among widely divergent evolutionary lines, as Conway Morris stipulates. These findings strengthen the case that mechanical optimization can drive evolution, contributing, therefore, to the long-standing debate over the evolutionary roles of randomness versus physical constraints that limit the solutions that are feasible in living creatures or entities. In sum, qualifying physical properties that underlie biological phenomena could help us recognize when an optimal solution is likely to drive convergent evolution. Having considered minimally what the preceding analysis of Conway Morris's postulates mean both biologically and philosophically, what then do they implicate or mean theologically? That is, for those kindred people like me who aver a divine involvement in evolution. Well, I can see that the evolution of, I can see that the origin of life on Earth was virtually inevitable, given the early chemical composition of oceans and the atmosphere, along with the nature of self-organizing systems, cross-reference Stuart Kaufman's voluminous Au revoir. However, while the laws of nature impact the general forms and functions of organisms, the channels are so broad that the details are left to chance. Indeed, the physical channels do not specify arthropods, annelids, mollusks, invertebrates, but at most bilaterally symmetrical organisms based on repeated parts. In fact, I suspect that given the early composition of atmospheres and oceans, life's origin was a chemical necessity. Contingency arises later when the historical origin of organisms enters the picture of evolution. Much less do the laws of nature specify the essential answers related to our own contemporary human origin, such as why mammals first evolved at all, such as why primates then moved from land to the trees, such as why animals, excuse me, such as why the fragile lineage of Homo sapiens sapiens emerged and then survived in Africa. This evidence suggests that God does not determine the outcome of every scientifically random event, which I herein define as being referent to events that are not calculable in anticipation of their occurrence, but instead constrains randomness by the setting of broad boundaries and thereby enabling convergences to occur. Indeed, God thereafter allows organisms to interact according to natural laws, which I have earlier specified as being the result of the embeddedness of the spirit within matter, that is the imbibification of spirit into matter, which causes matter to therefore be imbibified by the spirit of God. Right. And hence, creatures or entities both diverge and converge constantly within these constrained boundaries, providing a wide range of beautiful and complex results. In my own opinion, even if the radical interpretation of history that Gould postulated in 1989 in Wonderful Life proves unacceptable in its detail, a position that I am, by the way, sympathetic to. Many biologists have accepted that macroevolution nevertheless involves more than the mere endless fecundity of genes perpetuating themselves. Consider, for example, the great extinction event of the Permian period, more than 200 million years after the Burgess Shale. In this extinction within the late Permian period, the variety of vertebrate life on land was extremely and inexorably reduced. Moreover, if a meteorite truly killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago and only a few lines of life persisted, it was not because the dinosaurs were abysmal failures, nay, but because other series of animals, including our own mammalian line, were somehow gifted fortuitously by lucky stars with a better art of survival. Gould, in this sense, comes out the victor in this part of the drama. Earth's history, which contains a whole confection of various stressors, quote unquote, including such things as manifold climate changes and manifold sea level changes, manifold plate tectonics, manifold extraterrestrial events, has nevertheless danced with both life and without life in the midst of these stressors. While the reductionist approach to microevolution, especially the unscrambling of developmental genetics, has proven excessively successful in our understandings of the basis for the transformations of one organ into another, or even into an organ system, but much less for one species into another. These considerable discoveries do not explain fully the course of biological history. Only, my friends, I do contend, a contingentist macroevolutionary viewpoint encompasses the entirety of biological history. Full stop. So then, what does my chapter on Peirce's thought upon evolutionary developmental teleology, in conjunction with his presentation of evolutionary causation, mean for late modern theists? I suggest to you all numerous things in what follows. First, Peirce's teleology is more than a mere purposive pursuit of a predetermined end. It is, rather, a developmental teleology. Although Peirce used this term developmental teleology, quote unquote, only in the discussion of the development of human personality, I assert that it is also applicable to his idea of teleology in general. Learning from the developmental aspect of our own human purposes, we can inductively infer that all final causes in nature are, at least in principle, subject to evolution. This means then, my friends, that final causes are indeterminate, which may help to explain the randomness that is everywhere present in our uni/multiverse. Thus, as a second summary point from Peirce, final causes evolve and they're not static. Hence, the evolutionary developmental teleology of Peirce is characterized by the continuity of the macroevolutionary process itself. And this principle of continuity is essential for his evolutionary developmental teleology, as I term it, and his understanding of reality in general. Third, I maintain that a significantly revised conception of teleology must be developed if it is to see a resurgence of widespread plausibility in today's somewhat scientifically literate populace. Indeed, as many late modern theologians uniquely emphasize God's love, such a picture is conducive to a proper theology of evolution, as well as the development of a pertinent theodicy, I should say. Note that a theology of theodicy is something that I seek to work for in the future, or seek to work toward in the future. Cross-reference my books that are under contract regarding disabilities and of course my own traumatic brain injury and so forth that I mentioned earlier before the telecast started. Moreover, I contend fourth that the conception of teleology may need serious revision for it to even be maintained as a viable theological category. One contribution of Peirce's view is that it pictures teleology as evolving, and it is seen to be as a general goal versus having a definite end state or goal predetermined. This helps explain a lot of the evolutionary dead ends to which our fossil record attests. In dialogue with Peirce, I argue fifth, that teleology emerged out of the increasing complexification of life on Earth and continues to be general, not specific. Such a contention as mine, or as that rather, bodes well in a thoroughly evolutionary paradigm, such as the one I advocate herein. Moreover, or furthermore, as a sixth point in dialogue with Peirce, I conceive of teleology as at least partially self-determining. Self-determination is, in fact, fundamental to an evolutionary developmental teleology, and late modern relational theists would therefore want to preserve it. They find a pattern for doing so with respect to how Whitehead says that everything is self-created. In Peirce's agapism, he presents a condition that is permissible of future growth, and this condition does not negate any tendency that may seem at odds with it. All of these points could and should be reviewed and possibly appropriated by the contemporary relational theist movement. As such, the quote-unquote directedness of the condition may be characterizable in terms of the God that gives of himself in an act of more potent love without any conditions of potential responses to that more potent love, and what responses may fulfill that more potent love. It is rather merely a display of completely reckless, overflowing, amorepotent, and uncontrolling love. Cross-reference Ord for the last part, uncontrolling. Seen as such, the many and varied manifestations of complexity that macroevolution has given rise to can be seen as a fulfillment of the teleological goals of God. Important point. Such a view places import on even the most disparate species produced by the evolutionary play. That is, everything has worth. God's nature, as it is pictured within the theology and science conversation, is nothing short of creative responsive love, a la Cobb and Griffin, which is based upon fundamentally an infinitely relational God who is redemptively present in everything that happens from beginning to end. What's more, causation is a multifaceted event comprised of previous actions which are determined, future actions or future developments that are at least projectedly anticipated by final, that is teleological components, and current effects that are affected, perhaps even effected by chance events. These three assertions are comprised by Peirce in his view that each act of causation involves an efficient component, a final component, and a chance component. This mode of causality, a theological synthesis between kenosis and the evolutionary development and the evolutionary complexification of matter, mediated by the amorepotent, uncontrolling love of God through the creating spirit, is potent in application to relational theology and the contemporary theology and science discussion, and thus it should be included within both. It is fundamentally based upon my conceptioning of amorepotent love, as well as the uncontrolling love that Thomas A. Ord has argued for in several books in the preceding years. Furthermore, I find that the presence of randomness and chance in the natural environment is consonant with my view of a God who lures the natural world forward to higher levels of complexity, beauty, relationality, and diversity through the processes of biological evolution. As I see it, God does not determine the outcome of random events, but God instead constrains randomness by setting broad boundaries, after which empowered particles, empowered systems, empowered organisms, and other empowered entities interact cooperatively according to natural laws within the aforementioned boundaries, which produces a wide range of beautiful results. So then, instead of opposing God and chance, I further contend that chance was God the Spirit's idea, and that she uses it to ensure the variety, the resilience, and freedom, not to mention the maximal population necessary to achieve her purposes within the natural world. I would now like to give some general conclusions regarding my readings on macroevolution and my conception of canonically donated and amorepotent love. In noting that the love of the creating spirit is canonically donated, I mean to draw attention to the idea that she not only gives us love itself, but also herself in the very act of love, and that necessarily so. Further, in characterizing love as self-giving, I intend to once again draw attention to the fact that the creating spirit gives of herself liberally to the entities of the natural world. She, in fact, part of herself to it and them, both in a canonical manner. Hence, I say the creating spirit's love is canonically donated. In claiming that the love of the spirit is amorepotent, I am directly asserting that the enervating and erotic love bestowed upon the natural environment by the spirit is potent. More so, it is literally erotic love of the spirit enables entities and matter to desire, long for, and strive toward greater expressions of sentience. We see this throughout all forms of life. So then, in keeping with a general Whiteheadian framework, I in fact assert that all matter in varying degrees and levels have a hint of sentience. This hint, though, is shown to be most maximal in the modern Homo species, who definitively express the fullness of imago Dei. I assert that God gives out of God's fullness, but does not insist on controlling the responses of the natural world in response to that impartation of love. As such, God does not insist on having control. In this dissertation / book, I note that due to her nature being primarily canonically donated and more potent self-giving love, the creating spirit cannot control other entities, be they animate or not, although she could and does, in fact, lure, woo, bid, and beckon entities towards herself at the eschaton, which again necessarily includes the increasing of sentience, that is the imago Dei. Not simply that God will not control other entities, but cannot control other entities, and that necessarily so. For the God of self-giving, canonically donated, and Amorepotent love, the decision to express love comes first at all times. In my conception, Amorepotent love encompasses what is ordinarily contained within the definition of agape love, but it also includes eros love, for the latter is the love of co-laborment. In my appropriation of this terminology of eros love, I assert that it is the type of love that desires, for example, to expand one's territory or one's domain, which makes it applicable to the modern theory of evolution by natural selection. Evolution, that is, descent with modification, to invoke a Darwinian phrase there, recognizes self-giving love, then, and the goodness thereof, and that species regularly undergo commensalist, that is, commensalistic symbiotic relationships in nature, whereby one entity is aided by the other, while the other entity is neither aided nor harmed. This is self-giving, a more potent love in its entirety, my friends, and a proper demonstration of it. We are then, in a very real sense, God's fellow agents of creativity and God's fellow workers. God's love, however, is full-orbed. The union then of agape, eros, and filial love could be expressed as mutual aid, cross-reference Kropotkin, or a more potent love, cross-reference myself. Flourishing lives, be they divine, human, or some other mammal, I aver, consistently and necessarily express a more potent love. This notion that God's love is a more potent presupposes that God is a thoroughly relational being, and as relational, God both affects and is affected by those with whom God relates. God truly cares and is, in fact, the most moved mover, cross-reference Pinnock. Although God's creaturely entities truly affect and thereby effect change in this truly relational God, God's eternal nature of canonically donated, self-giving, and a more potent love remains unchanging. God's eternal nature is fixed. So then, again, this leads to the idea that there are two natures in God: the eternal nature and then his consequent nature, which is a distinctly Whiteheadian / Hartsonian theme, right? Which I carry forward, of course, I do. So let me start back over with that paragraph. Although God's creatures truly affect and thereby effect change in this truly relational God, God's eternal nature of canonically donated, self-giving, and amorepotent love remains unchanging. God's eternal nature is fixed. In fact, God's nature is love, and that nature never alters. However, the responses of entities to God's drive toward greater expressions of sentience in macroevolution influence the particular way, that is agape, eros, or philia, that God chooses to love the other. This theology of amorepotent love that I herein propose suggests that God's own characteristics and God's own relations with others influence the extent of divine love, as well as the manifestations of God's love. Indeed, because God is present to all entities, and because God loves perfectly in a canonically donated, self-giving, and amorepotent manner, all entities are therefore necessarily loved. They are in fact smothered with love, pelted by it, one could say. I further assert that my contemporary reconception of Gouldian contingency through the lens of Peirce, as one in which the general telos and goal of evolution is increased complexity and the generation of diversity broadly, and more specifically, increasingly sentient creatures, is both a plausible and a fruitful postulation. I contend, moreover, that God, the ultimate reality, intrinsically delights in both complexity and diversity, because the generation of greater complexity leads to entities that express greater sentience with which he may have relationship, and the production of increased diversity simply because God lavishes in the multiplicity of beauty. Moreover, I maintain that this general telos and goal is accomplished through God's initial pouring out of the Spirit, or that which I have referred to earlier as imbibification into chaotic nothingness, or kenosis summarily. This general telos and goal is further continues through the exploration of possible ends via the Spirit of God, and then also through the accompaniment of the Spirit throughout the emergentist process, culminates with the arrival of the evolutionary experiment known as Homo sapiens sapiens, which are fully sentient creatures. So then, this all amounts to, as stipulated at the onset of this book / dissertation, panentheistic, contingentist, divine involvement by a canonically donated, amorepotent, and uncontrollingly loving spirit involving herself in the processes of macroevolution in order to maximize complexity, relationality, and beauty in varied and multifarious forms, along with the extension of diversity and increases of multiplicity in the natural world. This is accomplished by not only the Spirit, but also by canonical creativity through cosmological causes, amounting to Spirit-derived causation through mutual immanence and contiguity with the natural world. That is, the canonically donated, amorepotent, and canonical Spirit innervates the creative advance into the future, which in a sense, though, is also entity created and entity directed. This is a position, my friends, of full mutuality between the natural world and God. So, to put a cap on this dissertation / book, macroevolutionary pathways reside within the parameters of the canonical Spirit's amorepotent loving intentions, and she, in fact, superintends them in the drive toward greater expressions of sentience within the natural world, which is the very definition of imago Dei, or the image of God. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Is there a question or a comment, maybe Robin or Andrew or John want to start off with?
Pardon? Yeah.
I was just saying if there's a comment or a question to beyond excellent work.
I have a million.
Okay,
I mean,
go, Robin.
Okay, excellent work. Gosh, Brad. I just want to comment objectively in a way that I'm not even sure your advisors will be able to, in saying that you've taken some stride over the summer in confidence. I guess I always thought you were the most confident guy amongst us, but you're way farther ahead in your confidence even than you were before. And it really shows in your writing, which is superb. I mean, superb writing. You're God, sorry, but I can't think of the word I want. You don't, somebody will think of it for me. You don't add extra stuff that you don't need. You just go right in there and you say specifically what you want to say, even though you also beautify it with incredible additives, you know, adjectively and other language things. But I would just say that just what was coming at me from what you read was a document that whatever little bit of self-confidence you lacked before, it evaporated in the heat of the summer somehow. And you're writing like the guys who are on your committee now, okay? You're writing with the hubris, and I mean that in the best way, that they all put themselves, I mean, they are the three most hubristic theologians I've ever personally encountered. And you're writing like they're just so full of themselves. You are so full of yourself in the most wonderful way. And I mean, you're so convinced about your ideas. And it just made me realize that that's what most of us don't have. We sort of go into our projects apologizing for them. We invite people to just tear us down about them, which is what we try not to do in this group. But still, I'm just saying we're apologetic and we lack self-confidence, and you don't lack that at all. You write like you're Phil's best friend instead of his advisee, even though you're very respectful toward him. So that's just one thing I want to comment on. And I have a lot of more detailed questions that we may or may not have time for today, and I won't share them with you now. I also want to ask you specifically about several words that you use, but that doesn't have to happen right this minute either, as long as you and I do have that conversation about them.
Sure.
I just want to again say that I think what slapped me in the face in a good way, like I'm thinking of being a kid and being at the ocean, you know, the few oceans I got to be at as a kid where the waves were just gigantic. And
You're freezing on us, Robin.
Why don't we come back to Robin, because she has the worst internet connection in the world. So Andrew, and let's hope, and then Marlene also lost connection. She's trying to get back in. So hopefully we'll see Robin and Marlene in a second. Andrew?
Oh, hi everyone. Thank you again for the presentation, Brad. It
I'm back.
Well organized. Okay. I just tossed a question up there. I've been doing a lot of Zoom meetings and I found that the chat question works good. Feel free to ignore it if you want, but I just wanted to put it out there when it was on my mind in case I forgot. If you want to address it, that's fine. I just thought I heard you say humans were fully sentient, and then I just thought I heard you say that we're going towards increasing sentience. So I just was wondering if you could elaborate on the latter a bit conceptually, if you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. Yes, sir. Thanks for the question, Dr. Bridges. What I meant by saying, and perhaps it didn't come out clearly enough, I'm not sure, but I assert that all entities in nature have a hint of sentience, right? And that's in keeping with the Whiteheadian / Hartsonian framework of reality. Now, the inherent drive toward increasing sentience is most maximally recognized, or I guess most maximally expressed, at least currently, by the fully sentient organs known as Homo sapiens sapiens. That is our subspecies. Does that make sense at all, Andrew?
Okay, yeah. So that's
Now
what you meant by.
that's yeah. Now, as I sort of modify that in the future, in the divine, excuse me, the God of chance and purpose, divine, the volume that's coming out that didn't make it into the dissertation, but nevertheless was part of my research for it, the one that's coming out in October, I reckon. As I explained therein, all entities have a level of sentience, okay, and even probably our various Homo progenitors have a level of sentience also. I'm not disputing that, which is particularly well demonstrated by Neanderthals, who, for example, buried their dead. So they had higher level cognition, of course, in the sense of humans today, because they buried their dead. No previous species, the Homo, ever did that, but Neanderthals did. I mean, going back to Homo erectus, go back to Homo flores, going back to the hobbits, things like that. They didn't do that, but Neanderthals did, in fact, bury their dead, which shows higher levels of sentience in them. Nevertheless, now to your question, can you explain the distinction between human beings being fully sentient and the idea of increasingly sentient? Okay. Well, again, sir, everything I contend, everything is on an upward drive toward the eschaton, being lured by the spirit, being behooved by the spirit, being beckoned, etc., like I explained it in the previous truncation that I delivered to you this morning. But I nevertheless, or this afternoon rather, but nevertheless, it's most maximally apparent in Homo species. Now, what that portends for the future, I make no claim of. So there could be a Homo sapiens, or whatever they name it after us. I mean, I don't know, that may come along and be more fully sentient even us. Does that make sense to you, Dr. Bridges?
Yeah, that's yeah. I thought that's what you meant. I just wanted to clarify what increasing meant, like a Homo Deus. Okay.
Right, exactly. Yes.
Thank you.
John, yeah, thank you, sir.
So I typed my question in chat, and is it clear enough, or do you need clarification to answer my question?
I
Bradford?
disagree with you. I disagree with you entirely. I do. I disagree with you, John. Michael
You
Roos
disagree with
does
what?
not deny.
What do you
He does
disagree
not.
with?
Michael Roos does not deny. Michael Roos does not deny an ultimate reality. He denies the God of classical theism that interrupts, that what was I guess manifest in Jesus, etc., like that. Classical theism. That's what he denies. That's what Michael Roos denies. Classical theistic God, not God, not the reference of ultimate reality per se. He
All right.
he broaches this on him. So I mean, he broaches this idea in multitudes of his books. Truly, he does. Yes.
Okay, well, let's get beyond the question of what Michael Roos thinks. I was leading that into the question of God talk in one's theory of evolution. Because is this all theoretical? How can you show that God is love, and as well as God's relation to the universe and creation? It seems to me very theoretical without really empirical verification. So the question I have is, how do we show a given God talk is true or not? Does that make sense?
How do-
Part of it.
You kind of broke up on me there, John. Right, but you want to.
So if we're in,
It's true.
so my question is, if we're integrating a theory of evolution with divine activity, how do we show and know that such divine activity exists? That's another way of stating the question.
How do we know that such divine activity exists? Well, how do we know that such divine activity exists? Overall, I contend that the increasing complexification of matter attests to an involvement of a higher intelligent source or ultimate reality of some sort, right? Because matter is being drawn by God toward the fullness of all things, right? So operating within the parameters, I stipulate that in the introduction to the book, which of course you're not exactly privy to, but I nonetheless show that I have some presuppositions, and one of those presuppositions is that God, that there is a concept that to which the term God could be meaningfully applied, right? Some sort of ultimate reality toward which the concept of God can be meaningfully applied. I stipulate that at the onset as one of my I guess coordinating principles, so to speak, right? Yeah, but so having stipulated that in the introduction, and then developing my theses throughout the remainder of the book, I then conclude, based on that assumption, that God, that I can speak about God and have such God talk as you call it, John. Does that accurately answer your question, sir?
Yeah, I think it's a question that could go on and on. So I don't want to follow up on it right now, because you basically answered it. So let's leave it alone for now. I want to give other people the opportunity to ask their questions.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
Yes. Yes.
I had another quick one, but if Jeremy or Robin or even John want to go first, that's perfectly fine with me.
Go, Andrew.
I was really fascinated by the language you used for the right after the second for the group presentation you sent us. You said tentative conclusions reached after this pursuit, and when you give these qualities of God, the sentience, the relational, and the beautiful, and that phrase you do, perhaps infinitely so. I found that fascinating, but I wondered if you could maybe elaborate a bit on why you said perhaps, or does it connote uncertainty or just openness, or what was that about?
Well, that was my way of saying, of course, that the God may be. Where exactly are you? What page you're on, sir? What page you're on, buddy?
Second page, right after the
Eight,
new to summary, or yeah, to the
Okay.
subheading.
second page. Okay, 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 gotcha.
It was just a fascinating way I thought of talking about the infinite.
Okay, okay, gotcha. Okay, yes, yes. As to a few conclusions that I infer after going through all this material, allow me to stipulate that I assume God is sentient, perhaps infinitely so. That was a way of sort of, I guess, saying that I think God is the most sentient being on earth, but qualifying it at the same time, if that makes sense to you at all. Yeah, I was using perhaps there as a qualification of the term that followed it, right? I don't know if I got to the meat of your question or not. No, sir, I don't.
I guess what I was sort of asking in that way is, it left me wondering if you thought that these qualities of God are infinite, or they could be finite or limited. And if you just sort of suspended judgment on that, or not.
Well, I think they are finitely limited in so much as they're conditional on the responses of the entities that derive ultimately from God, if that makes sense. So in that sense, they would be finitely limited. But in another sense, because they refer to God's eternal, unchanging nature, which I stipulated earlier, the core of God is infinitely so. But it's infinitely so. All those things. But of course, conditioned with he's got to have a world to be in I guess in cooperative relationship with, to be with, so to speak. Right. He's got to have some sort of an entity to forever be in relationship with, which goes back to my eternality of the world hypothesis, which I did not cover here in the conclusion. I cover elsewhere in my dissertation, however. But nevertheless, yeah, God always has something to be in relationship with. So he's always finitely limited by what the responses of his entities could have, but inherently in his own nature, that is the dual nature of God, that which is eternally unchanging versus what is conditionally appropriated based on the responses of his entities. That dual nature of God I spoke of earlier. In the sense, God has both infinite relationality and so on and so forth, but also in another sense, because it's conditioned by the entities that derive ultimately from God, it is finite in another sense. Does that make sense, Dr. Bridges?
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. It's quite fascinating because yeah, it's sort of yeah, the finite infinite distinction is yeah, it's quite fascinating. It's sort of a hybrid of a Hegel and Kant finite.
Yes, exactly.
Which is quite fascinating in and of itself. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, okay.
I just
Ms.
want to
Robin.
I want to piggyback on that question. This is what I was about to say when I got the big from my Zoom. Okay, so here is a quote from, I think this is on the first page of your paper, so a little bit before that passage that Andrew quoted from. You say, important critiques can only operate against great orthodoxies. And I was like, wow, that is so obvious and yet such a powerful statement. I think that's maybe what I was feeling about my experience of hearing you read this today, just that you were really operating in a mode of the fullest kind of confidence, conviction about that idea. And you are to a certain extent, I don't know to what extent, aware of, just as Andrew just said, that the aspects of what you do that are connected to people like Hegel and Kant, as well as the aspects of what you do that absolutely overturn people like Kant entirely. And not only overturn Kant, but overturn the whole tradition of orthodoxy. You're aware of the classical implications. Even if you know, as you're always telling me, I haven't read Kant, I haven't read Kant. Well, I hadn't read Kant 2 years ago, and I hadn't read Hegel 3 years ago. So it's only recently that I can see the kinds of things Andrew was pointing out too. But anyway, I just want to say that I was, my smile was very big as you read the first page, because everything you say, and here is perhaps the paragraph Andrew was talking about. You say, oopsie. I highlighted these in red. I assume that God is sentient. I assume that God is complex. You know, there are dots in between these things. I assume that God is relational. I assume that God is beautiful. Okay. When you say that God is beautiful, you are not in any sense contradicting classical or Catholic tradition or whatever tradition we want. I mean, I don't know who wouldn't want to say that God is beautiful anyway, but when you say that God is sentient, God is complex, and God is relational, Kant just turned over in his grave 3 times. He absolutely insists that God is not sentient. He absolutely, the classical tradition, as I think you know, insists that God is singular and not complex. Even the Trinity does not comprise an example of complexity in God, because that would be that heresy, whatever it's called. You probably know, and I don't remember it. And then you say that I assume that God is relational. Okay, and
tritheism.
Yeah, tritheism, and there's another name for it too. You're right. I just want to say, even though you guys will probably think I'm a big liar anyway, the paper or the part of my dissertation, or whatever we want to call it, that I'm working on right now, and that I probably will present whenever it's my turn to present, I named right before I logged in today, Kant and relationality with God. Okay. But you guys are going to all think I stole that from Bradford now. But I have read everything I can find about what Kant says about that. And of course, Kant says absolutely no way, no how. We cannot have any kind of communication with, we can't sense God. God is not sentient in the way we are. The only reason we're sentient is because we have bodies. God does not have a body. And one day, fingers crossed, if we're lucky, when we end our life in this body, we might end up having more like an experience that God has, which is fully automatically intuitive without needing this thing that we call sentience. So I just want to point that out and throw it back out at you and ask about just your feeling. I'm not challenging it at all. I loved your paper. In fact, last thing I'll say, and then you talk more. I did write here somewhere in my notes that you had me almost at hello. By the second page, I wrote a little note to myself that said, yeah, I feel that we can no longer tolerate that old idea that we can't have communication with God. If we're going to tolerate that idea, we might as well just throw God out the window. Why even have God? You know. So anyway, that's all I want to say. Go ahead.
Can I respond to that though? Right.
Yeah, right.
In somewhat jazz, you made reference to the idea that shucks. Come on, Bradford, think about it. Oh yes, about the physicality of the bodies and so forth like that. Well, I view all of God talk, as I elaborate in former chapters to this, all God talk through the lens of Jesus of Nazareth right? That, of course, right? So, and Jesus of Nazareth was, in fact, according to tradition, and to which I do adhere to in some sense. It was modified by me, but it's nonetheless somewhat some sense anyway. The God was that Jesus was God in the flesh, if you will, right? So, building on that, and also scriptural, I'm going to go back to scripture here also. Scripture, particularly exactly written by Paul, but that's not here. I don't want to get in discussion of that. But the Pauline tradition that, you know, of course, he says that well, actually, this is Peter, but elsewhere, Paul or the Pauline tradition intimates virtually the same thing. But Peter, for example, and whoever wrote Second Peter, I'm not going to get into that either. But whoever wrote Second Peter tells us, I think in chapter 3, that or chapter 2 maybe, that when the Lord descends from heaven with the shout and with the trump of God, the dead in Christ will rise first, enjoying to meet him in the air, in their physical bodies.
Isn't
So I
that
think
isn't that
embodiment, as I
1
Excuse me?
Corinthians 15, Paul? I believe that's 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul.
oh, okay,
I
Okay.
actually think it's
It's Peter.
Thessalonians.
Yeah, right. Okay,
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 got to be one of those.
okay,
two.
okay.
Yeah, but
I'm not referencing right now. I'm just going based on my memory, so I apologize if I misappellate that. But anyway, but that when the Lord descends from heaven with a shout and with the trumpet, and then with the trump of God, and the Lord being Jesus of Nazareth, right? The dead in Christ will rise first and join to meet him in the air, and so forth. And as I develop elsewhere, I contend that that necessarily includes a bodily state in the dissertation. So then, that's why I make reference to the idea that a disabled person will not suddenly become non-disabled, right? Because I project that our resurrection, or joining to meet him in there, as Paul puts it, is of a physical nature. So then, the physical nature of Jesus, I contend, the physical nature of Jesus, the physical nature of all human entities, whatever reality you might want to attribute to the afterlife, and I'm not going to get in that. You might want to attribute to the afterlife. I contend it will be physical in nature, right?
That is so much not what most theologians say today. You know that. It's one of the things that is most commonly denied. It's like they lopped it right off the top in contemporary theology. But I can't help but listen to or read what you write and think, ooh, Ingolf's he's probably gonna give you, he's gonna give you some pushback. I've never seen him not give people pushback. He doesn't give it to you. He's gonna pass you no matter what, but he's gonna force you to answer some of these questions. But the thing is that you believe in the resurrection of the body. That's so classical. That's amazing. So he'll love that. Or he does love it already.
I'm wondering if I could just keep adding and pushing and just kind of going with this thought for a second. It's interesting, the text from, and I believe it is in Thessalonians as well, but that's neither here nor there. So this like idea of resurrection, and it's interesting when you brought in the eschaton. I was thinking Moltmann, right? That's where my brain went. And I know Faber, of course, is well versed in Moltmann. So I see that thinking. The kind of the what I'm curious about is, and great job, by the way, this is not a critique at all. Does it, I could imagine someone who says, well, the texts that talk about resurrection, or the texts that talk about these kinds of things, have their own religious form of life and their own cultural context, right? In other words, they belong somewhere else. And we might think about them now, but there's a way in which they can't be appropriated or expressed in that same way. And I think what I'm trying to unpack here is how the kind of religious form of life, the kind of way that people talk about being people of faith, I'm looking for how that is overlaid, right, with this kind of development of physicality as you've expressed it through, this through evolution. In other words, I can imagine someone who says, well, for me, it is an important idea that at the resurrection, I have a new body, because that's actually, I could imagine any number of people who might have that kind of spiritual or theological, maybe conviction or desire. And so, how might you respond to that person when they say, well, I don't, these other kind of things that you're talking about, how do you talk to that person, who is committed to that idea and might not understand the kind of activity of integration, right? The kind of the activity of integration that you're doing. I don't know if that question makes any sense. Maybe that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to kind of pull the ideas together, and maybe I'm trying to kind of resist the urge to, break them back apart, right? And to say, well, that's just, what you're talking about is a different kind of form of life, right? And the things don't. They don't connect, which it's not what I'm saying, but I think that's what I'm trying. Help me understand how to work through that.
Well, I again basing my interpretation or basing my extrapolations on the example of Jesus of Nazareth, whom I again sort of I guess preconceive as the manifestation of God on earth. Again, that's a preconception, right? But Jesus, when he was resurrected, he may not have. If you remember, if all three of the synoptic gospels anyway report this in some different way, but the disciples didn't recognize him, right? Remember that, guys? Gals? The disciples didn't recognize him. Okay, well, but then Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, asked him, was it Peter, I think? Asked Peter to put his hands into my side, right? And then of course Peter did that. I believe it was Peter anyway.
Thomas.
And they said, Lord, he said, my Lord and my God, right, in response to that. So that gives me sort of the principle that although this may not be a fully physical resurrection in the sense that we have the exact same bodies. I mean, because that brings up issues around well, when will you be what will you be resurrected at, as a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 60-year-old or what? But nevertheless, I don't want to get into that, but nevertheless, in some way, our physical resurrection, I contend, based upon the scriptures, will be sort of conditioned by the wounds we have in our past. That's why I say, for example, that God will not heal me of my TBI at the eschaton, right? Because I mean, I'm taking Jesus as my guide, which I again presume to be God in the flesh, in that his injuries, if you will, persisted after his resurrected body. I'm not sure if I at all answered your question.
You did, and I'm just going to add to it. So because that was very clear. So my next kind of prompt would be: is the act of Thomas, right, touching the wound, right, is that a theological activity in terms of how we think about it, or is it an act of physicality? And this distinction might be completely arbitrary and and fictitious in my mind only. When I read that story, right, I see a theological expression. I guess what I don't see for me is a description of the physical world, right, such that I would draw a different kind of conclusion from it. So that's, I think, that's my question, right? That's where I'm wondering about the kind of the creative integration that you're doing to, help me understand, that kind of both and approach, which I think is part of what you're offering us.
Well, it is exactly right. It's a both and approach. I take elements of historical Christianity and then refine them in accordance with my evolutionary views. You're right. It's a both and approach. But nevertheless, in response to your question, I contend that was not a theological overlay, that was an actual depiction of what occurred. So in so much as that was, I take it at face value. I don't want to spiritualize it in any way. I take it at face value that the resurrected Christ was in some manner present with the, I guess, the apostles, right? And the apostles plus one, so to speak, right? But nevertheless, but it was not in the exact form of his physical body, but nevertheless was physical in some sense. And I don't know if that answers your question, Jeremy, or not.
I think it was helpful. It's a helpful clarification.
Okay.
I don't know that my question can be answered. It's because it's
Okay.
internal to me.
Yeah.
Plus Bradford. Well, I loved what you said about that our wounds. It's almost, you didn't say this, but it's almost like you said, our wounds or injuries will just be not, you don't want to say healed or taken away as if they were something bad. They themselves will be resurrected in a way.
Yeah.
I just want to say that Marlene and I have talked many times about whether we could stage the kind of, without experiencing a lot of pain and suffering, the kind of accident you had and acquire your traumatic brain injury, because we would like to be able to do what you do. I mean, what you've described to me about your before and after, who wouldn't want to have what you have now? I mean, I would like to have it. It wasn't given to me.
Yeah. Well, as Phil says, my traumatic brain injury, although of course I had tremendous times of recovery. Truly, I did over several years, what have you. And in fact, I'm still recovering in a sense, even today, because I'm learning new things, what have you, that I have to adjust to and have to I guess, integrate into my social skills. But nevertheless, as Phil says, that traumatic brain injury probably has given me the unifocus on the singular focus would be a better way to put it, on doing that which I have at hand, so to speak, right? So, but I would dismiss that outright if I could go back to go back to a fully sentient self, so to speak, right? But
oh yeah, I forgot you told me. I don't remember what you have said that you're missing, but you don't remember anything from then, number one, and I don't remember other ways that you don't consider yourself fully sentient, but you've told them to me before. So bless you, Brad.
Okay,
you are a miracle. I'm sorry, you don't believe in miracles, but you are one.
Oh now. But no, I mean, I have returned to a great state, and of course, but I like all the sociality that I developed. As you all know, most social skills are developed in the first 1 to 3 years of a human's life, correct? And then, of course, so I missed that, so I'm lacking that, what have you, and plus I'm missing all the memories, from roughly actually 18 forward, or 18 behind, I should say, 18 back. So, and I have no recollection of those formative experiences in my life. I know them intellectually because I've been told stories about them from everybody under the sun, so to speak, but I don't remember them, if that distinction makes sense to you at all. Right. So I have adjusted over the last, 21 years. pretty well. In so much as I'm not the bastard I used to be, so to speak, just real cold hardened and so forth, that I used to be prior to my prior to the I guess prior to my to my to my capitulation to God in the cotton field back in 2000, 7/24/2000. But nevertheless, I'm still lacking a lot of the social skills that I need to actively, I guess, exist in the world today, so to speak. So I am at a loss in that sense.
That's been our function in your life. We're your nursery, your social skills nursery.
Yeah, that's funny. Anybody else have any further questions, or we can wrap this up? Oh yeah, by the way, I must say before we wrap things up that I responded to all, I think, in Jeremy's message, that one of the last messages that he sent to me regarding my Zoom link for my defense, which is on the 22nd, not the 29th, because had conferences, I think, in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not never on that continent, I do believe, if I'm not mistaken. But on the 29th, so we had to back it up a week to the 22nd, if that makes sense. I hope all of you can. I guess, attend at least virtually, if not in person.
How
Indeed.
could we attend in person though?
Well, this is not settled yet, but they're thinking perhaps having it on campus with, I mean, this is not settled yet. This is something that's going to become settled in the next, 2 weeks now. But nevertheless, they're pondering the idea of having the defense in person with me, Roland, and Phil there, right, and then zooming in to Ingolf, wherever he might be at that time, right? Because, and that's why they moved it up to 9 a.m. also, because Ingolf, of course, what'd you say, Robin? That'd be what, 6 p.m. his time, if I remember correctly. Yeah, and so anything beyond that would be just too late for it to transpire at all. But that's one possibility. The other possibility is that I sit at home here and defend it via Zoom for all of them. They've not determined which they're going to do yet, if that makes sense. But the Zoom link, nevertheless, that I've sent you will be active and ready. Indeed, it will.
Very exciting.
Either way. Thank you. All right then. Well, I feel kind of bad that I left out so much, what have you. But I wanted to be cognizant of the time that that y'all wanted to contribute to this endeavor, right? So I cut out a lot of stuff, what have you. But it was my. I mean, I read through that condensation of the presentation. Again, I guess it was Thursday, was it not, Jeremy? Or maybe Wednesday when I sent it out to you.
Yeah.
And I thought it flowed okay, but not perfectly. Right. So if there are any, I guess, remaining questions, I might address it in my dissertation itself, if that makes sense to you. Right. So,
Right. I have one last question I want to ask. Oh, sorry.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Remember when we were talking, you and I, and maybe in the group, I can't remember, in the spring, about the fact that Philip told you that, and we had also sort of talked to you about this a bit, that the thing that you were going to have to do, and that was going to be a challenge, was after going so far into the science stuff during the last year or so, you had to bring it back to theology somehow. And you really did that. And I just want you to talk to us about how that happened for you.
Okay, great. How did that transition from purely scientific work manifested itself in my return to to, theology? Well, it took a lot of time and effort. I'll be honest with you, a lot of revisions. In fact, my friends, this is my 22nd copy of my dissertation draft that has been submitted to my committee.
Wow.
22nd, two, right? But anyway, I as far as the return to theology and bringing it home, so to speak, I can simply attribute that to multiple mulling overs, so to speak, multiple mulling over, so to speak, of the theology that I get out in the first couple of chapters, right? I don't think that answers your question very well, but I mean, it addresses it at least
no, because the
partially.
first thing you ever
I mean,
presented to us was maybe your first chapter, and it did have that's when we first heard Amorepotent. God, why I don't get that right, I don't know. So.
Okay, right, all right. But as my dissertation itself progresses, of course, I my introduction lays the foundation, of course, as you all know it should, right? And then I move into chapter 2, where I explore a heavily scientific chapter based on Stephen Jay Gould. Then I transition in chapter 3 because Gould highlights the progress in the evolutionary realm, or at least touches on it in several of his books that I had referenced in chapter 2. He touches on the idea of progress in biology. I transition and then in chapter 3 into a discussion of the temporary neo-Darwinian biologist named Michael Roos and his development of the idea of progress in evolution. Then in the 4th chapter, I revert back to, in the 4th chapter, I sort of counterbalance, you could say, the contingency that Gould presents in chapter 2 of my dissertation with the counterbalancing, so to speak, of Simon Conway Morris's convergence theory in chapter 4. Then in chapter 5, I make a philosophical excursion that may very well, as I term it, be the hidden foundation behind the contingentist viewpoint of Gould by highlighting the contributions of Charles Sanders Peirce. Then in chapter 6, and then in chapter 6, I move toward my appropriation of Thomas J. Ord's Uncontrolling Love in conversation with my own view of Amorepotent love, right? And then I sort of bring it all together in the conclusion. But that sixth chapter was very important for me, refining and sort of editing, I guess you could say, that chapter made me realize that I need to amplify the theological position in chapter 7, which is my conclusion. And again, I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
It does very
that
much.
just gives you a little background. Okay. All right then. Yeah. Nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, and this includes those who are not here as well, or who have left by some other means because of their internet connection and so forth, I do heartily invite you at least to Zoom with me on the 22nd. How I will know you're there, I know not, because I won't be operating the computer per se, but it'll be good to have a presence, a contingent, so to speak, of my dearly beloved friends there with me. I'd appreciate it greatly.
We're your boon companions. We'll be there.
Yep, we'll be there.
Ideal.
So it's in the calendar. So
Ideal.
all right.
Thank you,
Well,
Jeremy. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. So Brad, what I'll do, I'm gonna end the recording. And
Okay.
oh wait, nope, that was the wrong button. Hold on. There it is.